Splendid timing! You two are just in time for the fireworks show! Boom!
I hadn't played Resident Evil 5 in many years before this year. I enjoyed the game, but I wouldn't say that I particularly loved it. It was fine, and I played it a couple of times after it first came out, but it had been a number of years before I picked it up again. I still feel the exact same way I did when I first played it. It's fun, but I don't know if it's better than an 8 out of 10 to be truthful. Yet for some reason, possibly because it's, of its eventual sequel, Resident Evil 6, or the game that came before it, Resident Evil 4, there is something that at least draws people in where they want to keep playing it. That, they enjoy it, really. That there is an aspect of the game that strikes many people that makes it something that people want to play. I don't know, it's really hard to explain. Like, with Resident Evil 6, which I think is a little clear on why people like it, surprisingly enough, there's something that makes people want to play that game. For 6, it was just a different type of combat style that was the clearest departure from the series since. Yet, strangely enough, Resident Evil 5 is probably more in line with old Resident Evil horror than new. So, why is that? Why is this game still one of the most popular games in the franchise? Resident Evil 5 is one of the single most interesting games of all time, really just for a litany of reasons. It's both, in my view, a truly great and a truly bad game at the same time. It's a game that, chronologically speaking, of the overall story of Resident Evil, is, in my view, really the climax that had been building for over a decade. It's also a game that, at the time, sparked ridiculous ideas of racism based on the game's setting, but I'll touch on that later. Never has a game been just fascinating as a game like Resident Evil 5. To this day, although many dispute it, it's actually still in the top 2 of the high-selling Capcom games of all time, up there with the likes of the Resident Evil 2 remake, so I know I'm not alone in this feeling. But why specifically is this game piquing my interest? Many reasons outside of the broad ones I just listed. I bring this particular game up, by the way, with the possibility, and primarily of the reason, is the possibility of a Resident Evil 5 remake potentially coming, and me seeing people talking about this game, stirring up far more controversy today than back then, and it got me thinking about Capcom and their plans for the series, and how would they even approach a game like this if they wish to do a remake of this game? And why do I find this game always intriguing? Is it because of the controversy? Probably, and most likely, but it's really more than that. I mean, for starters, it has one of the most interesting and really bizarre, and in some cases I think brilliant storytelling that is also in some way a little lazy with its story and premise. This is the first game outside maybe Code Veronica and Zero that really brings things back truly in a very real way to the history of Umbrella and the founders, and really the game that started this whole series off, the first Resident Evil game. It helped that, the loading screens literally give you dated history lessons on the series that tell you the events before and even during the various games. They even literally take you to the flower that originated the progenitor fires to begin with. This game really does make me want to remember the original Resident Evil, for better and worse, and how far these games have gone since with its story. It's not the most incredible story, and really what I mean by that is that it's a little lazy. Just the premise of the Ouroboros virus, and although it's a continuation of, the Lost Plagas, it is in some ways just a viral swap of Resident Evil 4. And it's not aided by this fact that it's really just the next numbered game in the series, and it's just continuing just this trend, I guess. Regardless of that little nitpick, there is something very unique and replayable with this game when it comes to its fascinating story that makes people want to come back to it, and I think it's because this game is supposed to be, and represents, at least from its overall themes and narrative, a very unique love letter to those who love Resident Evil, and in many ways, an ending to the original Resident Evil story that started this entire franchise off to begin with. Now, I don't know if anyone's going to be coming or going to play this game for its gameplay or its dialogue, which even for the time had its issues, some variation of tank controls, over-the-top enemies, and don't even get me started with Sheva's AI, because that's its own thing. Although remasters and ports and I think just general patches have fixed a lot of her issues, but that I think is also a reason why this game is interesting and why it piques my interest, because in many ways it's just so unbelievably different from even its predecessor, Resident Evil 4. It is abundantly clear that the focus of this game was and always is towards action. And let me explain it, at least let me order my thoughts, because I think in order to really understand this game, I have to go through my own train of thought, and I think it's time I break down the story in depth, and I believe I should do this chronologically because the Lost and Nightmares DLC is quite fun, and I think it's also integral to the story, and also just to see how my brain processes all of this. So let's begin.
Ago, the BSAA received intel as to the whereabouts of Umbrella's founder, Oswell E. Spencer. Jill and I were ordered by the BSAA's European headquarters to apprehend him. We accepted that mission in the hopes of uncovering...
The game's story takes place years after Resident Evil 4, where bioterrorism is a threat to civilization and has grown exponentially that countries from around the world have banded together to create the BSAA, or the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance. They were created on behalf of the United Nations as an international peacekeeping force to investigate and stop bioterrorist attacks across the globe. Chris, since the events of Code Veronica, has joined this bioterrorist police force of sorts, doing what he can to protect the people he loves and to seek out those who wish to do harm to others. Notably Wesker, who has largely been the Resident Evil series' big bad since the first game. Jill Valentine has joined Chris, and together they have done what they can to help and protect as many people as they can. Now, the story really starts in the game's DLC, where Chris and Jill have tracked and are finally ready to arrest the man who started all of this, Oswell E. Spencer, at his mansion in really the middle of nowhere, it seems. This adds a bit to my belief that, it is a bit of a throwback to the game, a reminder of the game that started it all, Resident Evil 1. As literally entering the mansion, you get that same feeling of being in the Spencer mansion all over again. Although you literally are in his mansion this time. Even a little tidbit, by the way, forget how to do it actually, but you can even enable fixed camera angles if you really want to be immersed in this DLC. The DLC, although short and sweet, is a good and fun reminder of the old games, going back to strange and weird puzzles that you have to solve in order to progress. Lots of backtracking and documents for those who love the lore, not to mention the part where Jill potentially is going to be crushed again, but no sandwich this time. As you progress through the mansion, we see the history and backstory come to life, whether it's his butler's memories, as he sees Spencer go down this rabbit hole, even seeing the list of candidates in both Albert and Alex Wesker. The history can really be felt in this mansion, and the more you progress, the more disturbing things you'll come to find, including a dungeon with decomposing bodies and large monstrous and infected dungeon creatures who wander this dungeon and parts of the mansion. Now, once you reach the crypt area is where it gets a little more nerve-wracking. Once you lose your weapons and you're being hunted down by these creatures, you have to think, how are you going to get past this? It's not the biggest brain teaser by any means, but it's enjoyable and something Resident Evil really needs more of. Now, once you get past the crypt and make it back to the normal part of the mansion, you find Spencer's room and hear something. That something is Wesker. It's all juiced up and virused up and seemingly plays with Chris and Jill and battles with them until Wesker gets to Chris, which Jill heroically saves Chris, ending the DLC. Now, the DLC is needed, I think, to really enjoy the game, and it's the actual type of DLC that is additive. It's not the greatest extra content, but it adds more than I think to this story, and really probably should have been a part of the game from the get-go, and really just a part of the main game overall. Capcom probably got a little greedy there. It starts in Africa, in a pretty decent opening cutscene. A lot of things are established in a real cinematic way. A lady with a mask infecting someone with a mysterious virus. Chris meets Sheva and establishes that they're going to be partners and that they are in Africa. A real fish out of water experience for Chris to get through. From the get-go, the populace are all strange and violent and look at you not with the best of intentions. Let me say this first, by the way, that this game I don't believe is racist or even made with any racist intent. Numerous reasons support this. First off, it's made by a Japanese company. Japanese people who just set the game in Africa and showed the populace getting infected with a widespread virus. It's literally just the game and the setting they chose. It wasn't because of hatred, fear, or bigotry, just a choice that was purposeful and understandable if people actually played the game. And I hate people calling everything racist or bigoted because it doesn't conform to their worldview, or at its worst, something that is just a little uncomfortable that you're not used to. I don't think there was any controversy with the Spanish in their depiction during Resident Evil 4, and I personally believe if it was set in Japan, they'd do the same thing with their own people, behaving in the exact same way. They chose Africa mainly, I think, because the root cause and beginnings start in Africa with the original progenitor virus, if anything, sending out the message that life originated in Africa. Anyways, the game really starts when you get your assignment from your contact and the location of the BSAA Alpha team, where things start getting a little dangerous. The locals seemingly start getting violent, attack. I believe at this point they are either in stage 1 or stage 2 of their Plaga implementation and transformation, and violent enough that on the way to the rendezvous point, your actual informant/contact is executed right in front of you. They're on this mission to begin with because they're trying to capture Ricardo Irving, a bioweapon smuggler who may have an idea of what's going on in the local area, only to find Alpha Team and see that they've been massacred, presumably by something that Irving had to do with, the captain being the only survivor confirming this. Now, the first couple chapters is largely dedicated to the search for Irving, as well as uncovering little truths for the plot to eventually be uncovered. I like these little things that they do, planting nuggets for the payoff later, even if the payoff is more or less obvious. After the captain dies, you come across a creature that started it, a large black mass of tentacles that is the Ouroboros. You quickly learn it is not easily killed by conventional weapons. Finding fire is really the one thing that does the trick. Quickly thinking, you lose the conveniently placed incinerator down the hall and burn the son of a gun instead. With new data and news on the Alpha Team, the duo start making their way back to the closest area controlled by the BSAA, and you meet up with your pickup inland. They go through this port town filled with infected, and now called, I believe, Mangini. I noticed in replaying the game how well structured this level feels. It feels like the layout of the areas of, at least so far, the first chapter should be commended, as it makes sense. It isn't too complicated, in fact, it's actually really simple in retrospect, but somewhat claustrophobic enough to at least have me and need me to focus up in order to get through these sections, while still giving you enough freedom to just survive, even if an onslaught of enemies come knocking. Now, parts of this chapter, though, so far, at least in terms of the co-op, are starting to creep in, though. And also remember, this is the first game, I believe, that really implemented and started using co-op, at least within this series, and then continued to use them all the way up until, I believe, Revelations 2. Now, once you get past the port town inland, foreshadowing a chainsaw guy, by the way, you come across a locked gate with the only real means to open it is to literally throw Sheva across to another building in order to climb down and unlock the gate. If this game were on Nightmare mode or had the difficulty of a Souls game, I can only imagine the amount of frustration parts like this would give people. It's not hard on normal and easy, in fact quite forgiving, but she lumbers and opens herself up to attacks and certainly takes her time to open the gate while you have to defend her. Anybody that is adept at sniper games will revel in this, but for more average gamers, you might die at least once or twice on harder difficulty due to just inconsistent AI. It opens, you come across the Chainsaw Mangini, which is a staple at this point for these collection of Resident Evil games, starting in 4, and with 6 having a very strange mutated version of the guy. It's not really difficult and easy like the original Chainsaw guy, but I can imagine on far harder difficulties, this would not be a joyride by any means. I also personally don't have a problem with them recycling enemy types, even as this game can get repetitive and downplay the mystique and horror that the original guy gave you. I like them as enemies and they're a fun addition, even if they are repetitive from previous games and make them seem like regular enemies with more variations on the chainsaw guys. After that, you meet up with your pickup, who has been attacked and killed as you get ambushed Mangini riding motorcycles, who try to kill you in a very annoying quick time event. I personally hate quick time events. They're one of those old game concepts, I think, to keep players engaged while, they normally would enjoy just regular cutscenes. Once or twice in a game is one thing, but consistently as they did, and specifically in the Resident Evil franchise, tends to be a little bit of an overkill. It really would have just been far better to have an actual combat sequence in this part, and specifically as it would have made the game a little more interesting with how much they throw at you and how capable these Mangini actually are. We never really get to see that. Instead, quick time cutscene. Afterwards, we are rescued by Josh Stone, captain of the Delta team, who I think is a wonderful character and an honorable man. He gives us info on Irving being, a potential hideout, including information on Jill Valentine? What? I know, it's obvious if you pay attention, but even in the twist is simple. Again, setting things up to pay it off still adds some complexity and some excitement to the story. Since at this point, unless you played the DLC, this would be the first time these two legends together, since I believe the first one. I believe Revelations came out much later on the 3DS. We continue our search for Irving, first through the mines nearby the station where we have set up base. This part is actually interesting and would have liked to see more of this in the game, where there's a simple reliance and teamwork needed even if it's an AI to get through this section. In the mines for the first part, it is dark, needing a high-powered flashlight that is either carried by you or your companion, and you have to work together in order to progress and defeat the enemies if you want to make it out alive. While not scary, mainly due to the game's gameplay being so heavily action-oriented and the addition of a companion, it would have made this game far better, more thrilling and engaging, and I think really just more thoughtful had they put more sections like this where you really need to figure out what to do and where to go, especially, with no map to guide you. Now, in fairness, this is just a nitpick at best.
Oh shit.
So you must be Irving.
Wow, perceptive, aren't ya?
You think this is a joke? You're just like all the other pieces of scum terrorists.
Oh, I'm not like them. I'm a businessman with standards.
Drop the weapon.
Or, how about you drop yours?
Now, once you get past the mines, you find Irving holed up in a safe house building, where I gotta say, Resident Evil does it again with these bizarre characters that they are known for. This guy talks like Harley Quinn if Harley was a guy, and I would probably assume a Mets fan. Such a weird and off-putting character design, and I will say, if you wanted to create the stereotypical villain-looking character, this is your guy. Before he can be taken in, he is saved by the mysterious lady in the mask. I wonder who she is. They escape, and you are in pursuit, only to be stopped by a large bat BOW, who I believe is nicknamed, and I'm going to butcher it, Popokarimu, who proves a very simple but interesting challenge. I will say I found it funny that after blowing this thing to bits with landmines and a litany of bullets, the cutscene that ends the boss fight is literally Chris just shooting a god-tier bullet that puts it out of commission. Eventually, Josh comes with a jeep as we continue in pursuit. On the way to find and capture Irving, we get a distress call from Josh's Delta Squad that they need assistance and are under attack, where we then are besieged by Mangini in just a straight up and simple shooting section. Once we arrive to the location, we find the squad massacred, but by who? That thing, the native version of a El Gigante, is, it looks pretty scary and pretty cool. It's much faster and honestly a real missed opportunity for a fascinating boss fight. Instead, you just shoot this big guy with turrets in the simplest and most straightforward boss fight yet. I mean, I think it probably would have been more or less played out like the original, Resident Evil 4 or even the remake. Just a bigger, faster, stronger El Gigante. You need to be more reactionary in your defenses and precise in your attack, but I think they could have just done a regular boss fight and maybe expanded the area, allow you to hide behind buildings, maybe use the mines left over from the previous boss fight. Just a real missed opportunity. Bit of a slowly growing theme that is growing out of this game. Afterwards, we used the data we had recovered and discovered the location that Irving is planning on selling bioweapons and eventually just head out, splitting up with Josh. We then reach the marshlands, where Chris explains what happened to Jill. Again, not so subtle foreshadowing in the events of the Lost Nightmares DLC. Once we land, we discover a tribe of warriors, which the game, I don't really know how to pronounce it. I'm not even going to try. Just going to call them the tribe, who are all seemingly infected with the Ouroboros, or a very stronger version of the Plaga virus, as the mutations are vastly different than those in the town. They are stronger, faster, and mutate more dangerously, I'd say, and a little more durable. Apparently Irving had convinced the tribe, I guess, through some backstories and some notes, that if they took this vaccine, it would help against several dangerous and fatal diseases, which is aided by Tricell, another pharmaceutical company that seemingly had a hand in infecting these people. Now, here we actually get to explore the marshlands, going from island to island, avoiding these Mangini as well as alligators or crocodiles. I know there's a difference between them, but I can't tell. And, I like this area. All parts are largely different, and more of this would have been really cool throughout the game, like a mini hub area. Maybe every chapter should have had something like this, along these lines at least, a part where there was more freedom for exploration, like the sequels. Especially like Resident Evil Village, I think did it very, very, very well, where it's like a large, small hub world that almost feels open world, but actually really isn't. Now, once we reach the heart of the village, we are confronted with just these much larger Mangini who are quite durable. Incredibly so, to a point that even a couple straight shots from a Magnum won't put them down. The village part is actually quite fun, and the game needed more of this, as it starts off as empty, making you question why it is, and after exploring and really just unfortunately running to the wrong area, you are trapped in ambush and must fight tooth and nail to escape. Now, once we get past the entire village and really just another trap section, passing by Tricell tents, we reach an oil field where we are confronted by more chainsaw baddies. Now, once we get past them, we meet up with Josh, who is alive, and now the trio realize they are largely all that is left of the BSAA in stopping Irving.
This is going to be a pain in the ass, but I will see what I can do.
We escape the building and area as Mangini fill it with more enemies and a chainsaw guy for good measure, where the action-heavy elements are largely just in full swing here. Like, to me, this is the first time in the game where it is abundantly clear this game is just an action game with some horror elements to it. At least in previous parts, there was more of a challenge and some thinking that had to be done in order to survive. Here it's just mindless fighting and surviving waves of enemies as Josh helps you escape on a boat in pursuit of Irving. The game going and far leaning into its action elements are a mixed bag for me. I like action games, and this game does the action just fine, but it is also very strange and disappointing seeing this horror franchise moving away from the thing that made them famous and loved to begin with. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some horror elements here, but it's not like in the original Resident Evil where you are cautious and calculating with inventory and your own movements in those games where surviving is paramount. At least Resident Evil 4 didn't lean too heavily into the action, at least in comparison to this game. I think Resident Evil 4 strikes a good balance of horror and some genuine scares and moments of sheer terror, unlike in this game where there is largely no real horror. Now, I know it was also basically because of the market, and I know the original Resident Evil remake did not sell well, and it's like, oh, you're just gonna go with whatever the market tells you. Still, just a bit of a disappointing direction that the series was going in at the time, and this game is really just, you just feel it in every sense, and this is the first time I truly felt it. Traveling by boat and navigating the oil fields with enemies, we find Irving on a yacht with really nowhere else to run. He injects himself with a dominant strain of the Plaga, transforming into a large bioweapon that enters the water and attacks the duo, who uses mounted machine guns. And yet again, I just feel another missed opportunity with Irving as a boss fight. They definitely could have made this boss fight a lot more engaging, maybe although it might be a little more difficult with an AI companion. They could have done something that could have utilized the co-op aspect of this game rather than just using mounted machine guns instead. Maybe one person drives the boat, evading the mutated Irving while the other uses the gun to kill him. Instead, it's just a by-the-numbers boss fight. Irving's design, I think, looks cool and does at least, engage you enough. Shows how powerful a dominant strain of this Plagas can be and what it can do. Once you defeat Irving, who in his passing moments gives you 2 clues. The first, that is Tricell CEO Excella, is a part of what is going on. The second directs the duo to a cave that will continue their hunt and investigation, seeing that there's more to this particular case than just Irving. Anyways, you continue on to your mission, heading for the caves that Irving alluded to, conveniently nearby, I might add, although he could have just been heading there anyway, and it's just coincidence, where you find the same tribespeople and strange spider-looking BOWs are there, who are just annoying, by the way, guarding a large door that appears to be an underground temple. You enter to find what appears to be the ruins of an underground city that looks as if it's thousands of years old. Now, this section has you fighting more of these infected tribesmen, while also unlocking the main door that leads even higher to something else potentially. This part is actually quite fun. In Resident Evil games, the best parts, at least in terms of how I feel, are stressful but not overwhelming. Resident Evil 4, I think, feels this way for most of the game, where it feels tense and a little stressful but generally manageable. Unless you get to that dog maze in that game, which, God, I hate those parts. This section isn't difficult though. The enemies are quick and strong still, and the Lost City is a bit of a maze that you have to navigate. And don't forget, there are sunbeams that hit you in certain walkways. But this part is really one of the first times where it feels like a puzzle, and one that you have to really figure out how to go through in order to get to the other side. Most of this game feels like a straightforward game where you just fight enemies and go to the next area, where enemies feel like annoyances and by the book's numbers almost rather than obstacles. Unlike, like in this part, it actually feels like an obstacle, where the area is confusing and you have to really think for a minute in order to properly navigate this place. It's a welcome change of pace, if you don't mind me saying. The part that I think really works well is when you are more in that area that's like an actual temple, that structural area, and you have to maneuver the stairs in order to open up sections of the area. More usage of the co-op aspect of the game would have actually been really nice, even if it is with a rough AI companion, and even if it feels like basic pulling chains just to open up the next door. After that, you fight more Mangini enemies and are attacked by another one of these winged bat bioweapons, which is a little bit easier with simpler and better tactics, and let's just be honest, much better guns. Once you defeat the enemy, you proceed through the main door.
I believe I should thank you, Spencer.
A cutscene happens which shows and actually reveals a lot. Kind of crazy to blow the load already at this point, but a lot is revealed. Albert Wesker is alive and largely the reason for what is happening in this game. This also shows that Excella is not only in line with Wesker, but that she might be fooling around with the fool as she injects him with something, while also hinting at what his plans will be: Ouroboros missiles. Also, I just want to point out that I don't think Wesker should have been the main villain for this game. Maybe have him pull strings, behind the scenes again, but I think he probably should have been the villain of Resident Evil 6 instead, just considering how that game ultimately ended up turning out with its story and whatnot. And just a little nitpicky here, Wesker is the big bad. He's almost in many ways akin to Thanos in some ways for the Resident Evil franchise during the 2000s. Maybe another villain, one with similar aspirations, another cult leader, or just someone maybe even with just a little more sympathetic, like Mother Miranda in Village. I think it would have been a much better play and a much more interesting game overall. Now, that being said, I do understand in some ways why they ended up going the Wesker direction, because Wesker is the clear bad guy in these games, and there is a real battle between the forces of good and evil that is always the go-to. But a finale with Wesker in 6 would have been something else, really. But more on that later. Also, revising what I said earlier, the area with fire, death, or light is right after this cutscene, along with the first simple but very real puzzle that you have to solve that involves the firelight again in a fine form. Once you get through this area, you come across a bundle of flowers with tents set up there with the Tricell logo and what? Umbrella? So to explain it now, this is it. The origins of the Umbrella's beginnings in terms of its bioweapons and viral engineering. The flower itself is called the Stairway to the Sun. This flower largely is the origins of what would eventually become the progenitor virus used by Umbrella, and that would actually begin the events of the Resident Evil series. Personally, a really cool part of the game that I enjoy seeing when I did play it. Just continues to remind me, although it's been a while, that this game is largely trying to remind and throw back to the ideas of the original Resident Evil. Venturing further, you actually enter a research facility next to this bundle of flowers where it appears that the flowers are being researched upon. Venturing further, we then enter a very, very bloody area filled with what appears to be lickers, who I believe at this point in the Resident Evil timeline hadn't been in a game since Resident Evil 2. At least one that wasn't like, a Chronicles game or an Outbreak game. Here the facility appears to be abandoned, largely only with lickers, who clearly haven't eaten in a while, which involves a genuinely cool part where you try to be as quiet as possible in order to not disturb them before trying to escape in an elevator. Reaching the top floor of the facility, you enter one of the strangest and very interesting parts of the game, looking like a large, expansive room filled with bodies. I can't tell what is actually going on, but it seems like holding cells or units to hold these test subjects in. Chris tries to find Jill in this area before you are stopped by a large BOW called the U8, which I'm curious how in the hell we didn't hear or see this thing. I feel like it'd be a little bit hard to miss. Now, this is a half-decent boss fight, as you're on a circular platform and have to be very strategic in what to hit and where to hit in terms of his exposed areas. It's not easy, but certainly not an impossible boss. Not to mention a very interesting design with a much more crab-like look. Now, once you defeat the U8, you continue down and find that Jill is not there before talking to Excella, who reveals herself as being one of those who is actually working with Irving and is partially in line with the enemies who have been trying to kill Chris and Sheva. Continuing in this facility in search of Excella, and hopefully now of Jill's survival, Chris and Sheva go through waves of enemies as they encounter now more military-looking Mangini that start using guns, and of course, more lickers. Along the way, Chris and Sheva intercept a communication link that reveals Albert Wesker is alive, which worries Chris, but also drives Chris, knowing he is still alive. The facility begins turning into a factory, which appears to be making weapons, missiles most likely as shown earlier, in which you face more enemies, and the most dreaded thing of all, conveyor belts. A new enemy is introduced, a beetle of some kind that can immediately one-shot you if you're not careful enough. Now, once you get past this area, you enter what appears to be some sort of experimentation room with a lone man in a chair who looks just a little unhinged as Excella and the woman with the mask looks on, clowning on you, telling her plans effectively, just wanting to create a nearly perfect being with Ouroboros effectively through the evolutionary process with this virus. The man rises and turns into one of those Ouroboros monsters from the first chapter of the game, only seemingly a little bit larger. And although there isn't any furnaces this time, there's enough flammable canisters and a flamethrower on the wall you can use which can actually defeat this boss. And I do really wish they made these encounters a little more interesting and difficult. The franchise at the time going through their action phase and leaning away from the survival horror aspects was really difficult at the time. I'd rather face that boss with little or no ammo and face a challenge where I could think and would have to think. Instead, it's just shoot until they're dead. Sure, on harder modes that might be a little different, but the point remains that the encounter should have been far more engaging and forced us to apply some actual strategy in order to fight the boss or to think a little bit more. Whether it's our resources or our surroundings, I think like the Resident Evil 2 remake, I think they largely had the right idea with the bosses they had, whether Birkin in the underground or just fighting Mr. X on the platform at the end. It really forced me to really think and plan how I'm actually going to attack this guy. Sure, in this part there's some tanks with a flamethrower, the room's not that big, it's pretty small, so tight quarters, sure. But it just reminded me that most enemy encounters are largely just shoot until dead, and I think it would have been a far better game with, just much more creative implementation. Once we beat the enemy, we venture back onto the platform where we fought that big crab boss you wait in pursuit of Excella, and have to slowly rise up where we snipe enemies shooting at us before we can even continue. Not long after that, we go into Liquor Central, where we have to open and cross the bridge while being in pursuit of these liquors. This part I like. I wish there was actually more of this. Utilizing the co-op aspect like this is where, the fun of the game really comes for me. And, even though it's be shoot heavy and gun heavy, at the very least you really have to think about and utilize the co-op aspect of the game, which I think they could have actually implemented far more, and at least in a very creative way like this. We then see Excella, and before we can apprehend her, we are ambushed by the masked lady. We fight, she does some flippity flips before we shoot her mask off, revealing Jill, along with Wesker, which I always find funny that he hilariously points out that Chris is a little slow to catch on. Now we have to fight both Jill and Wesker, which again is a fun little fight that I appreciate. It's a 2-on-2 winner-take-all, sort of. For this fight, we just have to initially fight the two and outlast Wesker, chasing us for roughly 7 minutes before he leaves, and it's just Jill, Sheva, and Chris. We then have to team up in order to get the device off her chest, which is largely controlling her. And honestly, this part was actually a bit of a fun boss fight. Fighting them and then just Jill needing to use teamwork in order to get that device off, which feels like it took freaking forever to do. We then lean into the elements of the co-op. It can actually be at least a little fun and engaging. Once we free Jill, she apologizes and thanks us. Damn right, Jill. Just kidding. We then set off in pursuit, seeing a large freighter ship as Excella and Wesker are boarding it, with their plans being a little nefarious. Now, I'm also actually going to talk about the other DLC in this game, which details what Jill was doing while Chris and Sheva were in hot pursuit real quick. Here she passes out and is found by Josh randomly, who is in pursuit of the two, which, I gotta say, a little fishy considering all the stuff we just went through in these last 2 chapters. But whatever, I'm really just happy to see Josh, and I think in this DLC, they go very well together. First, we have to escape the fortress protecting this place by going through a very large regiment of Mangini soldiers who intend to do some real destructive things to us. Eventually, we get inside the main building where we are to meet our rendezvous, where Jill, remembering something important, wants to tell Chris and Sheva in the comms room that Wesker, while powerful, needs a serum and routine injections of it to keep the power and mutations from spreading and progressing. Once we make it out of this area, we head up to the roof where we must survive just really a pure gauntlet of enemies, which I will say on harder difficulties would just be impossible, as they literally throw everything at you along with the kitchen sink and a dryer for good measure. Now, Jill controls pretty well. Just basically the conventional same combat, I would assume, and I'd never really played as Sheva, but I'm going to assume that they probably play similar to one another. We then get to meet Doug, our pilot, and pretty much just a fun and pure alpha dude who saves us and defends us as we escape on our helicopter. Unfortunately for Doug and us, he is then subsequently killed as Josh is heartbroken over the death of his friend. The two then leave in search of Chris and Sheva. Dang it, Capcom, why you gotta make such a cool character and then just kill him off immediately like that? I wanted more Doug. Now back to the actual main game. Chris and Sheva, meanwhile, on the ship that just left the port for an unknown destination, have to navigate the ship in search of both Excella and Wesker. Here we see why Wesker killed Spencer back in the opening of this game. Wesker visiting Spencer, seemingly as vengeance for being really an experiment, along with Alexa Wesker as potential mortal beings capable of being gods. Part of me wishes we had more things like this, as we understand Wesker a little bit more. It's not to humanize him, but to understand why he thinks the way he thinks and the lengths and depths that he will go in order to achieve his wish. He truly wants to be just this literal god tier human being. Continuing through the ship, we find Excella and Wesker, with Wesker infecting Excella, seeing really no use for her, in which she turns into this gigantic Ouroboros monster. And after a quick time event where we escape her clutches, we enter the ship in order to avoid her growing and dangerous mutations. After fighting some enemies, gearing up, we head to the top of the ship where the bioweapon Excella rages and attacks looking like some giant plant monster, firing little sacks at us with just mindless vengeance. Once Excella is finally defeated, we then rush to stop Wesker, who is about to launch his attack and enact his plan to spread Ouroboros. Receiving the information from Jill, we enter deeper into the ship, where we navigate many enemies to Wesker. This last chapter overall is okay. It's a bit underwhelming so far, which is why I haven't commented as much on it. As a finale, it doesn't excite me as much as, you would hope. In fairness, I don't know if I would have ended the last chapter on a ship. At least in Resident Evil 4, you fought Krauser and then proceeded to go through trying to cure yourself and rescuing Ashley before you fought the final boss. I guess it felt like an actual ending. Again, it's not a bad ending or even really a bad lead up to it, but one just wishes overall there was more, just more. It's difficult to, determine if it's because the game itself is geared towards, action and the combat, or it's just hard to really explain. And the ultimate conclusion for me is that it's underwhelming, really just because it's a little bit rushed, because of the location, and just because of the actual gameplay and combat. I think just combined to make it overall a little bit depreciated in relative comparison to previous games. Regardless, reaching Wesker, seeing the plans that he plans to launch missiles, he attacks and captures Sheva, where we save her and begin a very good boss fight in my view. Here, Wesker is damn near a literal god, so he's so fast he dodges all your bullets, at times even throwing missiles at you. The lights go on and off, which forces you to explore the area first and find a missile launcher and rockets littered everywhere. This is where the teamwork and co-op really works very well and is greatly needed, as it's going to take 2 people to even damage him. Now once you figure it out though, with the lights blinding him, also because he wears sunglasses, actually turning the lights off, sunglasses, like a real asshole, you use the rockets to damage him. Once you do enough damage, you inject him with an overdose of his medicine and your, Ouroboros suppressant. You ended up basically defeating him as he leaps into his ship, where you both have to, fight him even more and take him on. Now this second battle is basically just a battle with some quick time events and just a very complicated cutscene. But in this second battle, with both of you really just losing pretty badly, you ultimately do get the upper hand eventually and are actually able to take the plane down into a freaking volcano randomly. Regardless of the circumstances of how you even got there, still pretty cool to end the game basically in the final boss in a volcano. Now Wesker mutates like crazy and we begin this intense fight. The ending of this game makes up for the so-so chapter that led up to it. To start, he begins by targeting Sheva as she has to fend off his furious attacks. Then Chris, in probably the single most bizarre and mean moment that is weirdly both perfect and also makes no sense in Resident Evil in so many ways, punches the boulder in order to dislodge it and allow Sheva to reunite with you.
Just hold on, Sheva.
We then fight Wesker toe-to-toe, giving him literally everything. This is a good final battle, at least in my eyes, compelling with stakes at hand. Fate of the world and all. Plus, he is more than a bullet sponge, where you do have to be a little strategic in your bullet placement. And if played with 2 people, would do wonders in terms of your coordination for the battle. One person maybe distracts and the other shoots him in the back. Even just going solo, it is a challenge, and certainly not easy, as he's clearly focused on you as you navigate fighting this guy. Now once you defeat him, Jill and Josh arrive to the rescue, where you use the fated and Resident Evil cliche of a rocket launcher in order to finally put Wesker down once and for all. Then another cliche as the quartet leave towards the sunset. I don't know if I would say this game is good or bad, to be brutally honest. I did a smaller review of Resident Evil 6 where I briefly explained that the game itself was a fun, if complicated and ultimately disappointing game. It had its clear problems, but ultimately that there was a foundation there where something really could have been built, where that would have been a truly incredible game had it been done right. I don't know if I could say that with Resident Evil 5, though that's really for a couple of reasons. First is that this game, even with its faults, it's just a better game than Resident Evil 6. It is, even with its faults, still a very well-paced game that plays and handles incredibly well. Also, the way it looks, I mean, it is just fantastic to play. I think even graphically it holds up very well even today, even better, ironically, than Resident Evil 6. I don't know if it's just the shading of the actual game, the contrast, but everything looks very exceptionally well done, and I think for a game of that generation, looks exceptional. Like Resident Evil 6, tried so many new things with a few things landing and many missing in terms of story and gameplay, but with 5, it's largely still in so many ways an older school Resident Evil game. It still uses some form of tank controls, albeit, as good as they could possibly be, and still tells a very Resident Evil story with, more emphasis on bioterrorism, and although serious in many points, it still has moments where it's just bizarre in story, or dialogue, or just general moments. Like, I mean, seriously, who thought voicing Irving like that was normal? Secondly, unlike Resident Evil 6, I don't know if a great or incredible game could be made out of it if, 5 were actually remade. Not to say a remake of 5 would be bad. I think it would be great, but I think it more or less would be like the Resident Evil 4 remake, which gives us everything we want, but is largely the same game in a lot of ways. A remake would hit the same points, but ultimately be the same game with, just certain plot differences. When I say I envision something like, a Resident Evil 6 remake, for instance, I mean completely new mission structures, maybe a semi-open world in certain sections that they could do, like an actual real emphasis on the horror aspects of the game. 5 at least has some of those elements that could be improved or even emphasized further. Like, imagine those spider things in the ruins just being remade. Just, God, no thanks. Now, I think it's more like Resident Evil 5 actually is a good game, not a great game. Probably never truly will be. Not that it's a bad thing, mind you, just more frustrating because it could have and probably should have been better than it was. I mean, it's a good, not great story, but still very good. Interesting shift to action over horror, and a co-op mechanic that many like and many loathe, although personally I'm indifferent overall to the mechanic. I think what's been on my mind since playing this game, and why I've been racking my head around this, is it isn't disappointment or regret or even thinking this game is good or bad. I mean, if I had to bet, it's because this game is in so many ways a point in history of both video gaming and this franchise of where they were going to, which makes sense since the larger industry went that way along with Resident Evil, action-oriented and shooting-oriented mainly. This game is important for what it represents, even though this game is just a strange game in general to have exist. Again, not a bad game or a good game, but still somehow an important game that reflects the history of video games in a small way, but importantly as both the future of Resident Evil and a careful reminder of what made this game and franchise popular even to begin with. And I think in my last point, with really even more thinking, it really is the pinnacle of this era of Resident Evil games. Like, I believe there are about 3 different eras of Resident Evil games. The original era, I would probably say all the way up until 4 with the first game, the action heavy era, and then I would say the remake era. And I think this game is the pinnacle of an era of Resident Evil games that I enjoy but don't necessarily want to come back to. And I think being the best of that series in that particular era, I think means something. I think that, is ultimately the feeling that has been driving me to be a little wacky whenever I think about this game. Again, not a bad game, great in so many aspects, but one that isn't my era or my cup of tea. Anyways, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. You guys are awesome.
More and more, I find myself wondering if it's all worth fighting for. For a future without fear? Yeah, it's worth it.
Just